Okay, hello and welcome everybody, and welcome to today's 90-minute webinar, We Are All Brain Builders, Enabling Workforce and Organisational Capability and System Change. Before we start today's webinar, I'm going to pass to Sheryl Bachelor, who's the founder and director of Yiliyapinya Indigenous Corporation, who's going to do our acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Sheryl.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a very proud Aboriginal woman with ancestral ties to Kunja, which is near Calamala in Queensland. I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are all meeting today. For me, it's Yagara country in Brisbane, Queensland. And thank them for allowing us to meet on the land that I am in, and I'd like to acknowledge the land that you are on. I pay my very deep respects to past, present, and future traditional owners and elders of this beautiful nation of ours, and the continuation of our culture, spirituality, family, law, community, and educational practices of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are involved in the webinar today. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my very deep respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their struggles and their hardships that's allowed me to be here today as an Aboriginal woman running an organisation. I look forward to working together, walking together and healing together with everyone to help our children, young people, families heal, feel strong and deadly. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Sheryl. That was beautiful. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming today from Gubbi country and pay my respects and acknowledge the ongoing wisdom and resilience of our First Nations colleagues. So before we start today's webinar, I'm going to do some housekeeping. So all questions, comments and feedback, please put into the chat throughout the session. So you don't need to hold those for the end. You can put those through as you go. There will also be time at the end of today's session for questions. So that will be a chance for you to ask and speak to the panel and share your thoughts. Today's webinar comes to you as a collaborative effort with huge thank you to Paul Ramsay Foundation for putting this together and for being really the catalysing people in the background for it. So the collaboration today is between Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland, Yiliyapinya Indigenous Corporation and Gladstone Region engaging in action together. So in this presentation, we're going to be exploring how neuro-informed strategies to catalyse systems actually works in practice. So we know there's lots of great evidence. What are we doing with that evidence? How are we translating that evidence? And what does that mean in practice? So each of the panel members are going to be speaking about their area of expertise, and it's going to take us on a journey from the system level through to really understanding brain building and what that looks like, unpicking what neuroscience means in practice. And then finally, having a look at what this looks like through the incredible work that Lorna and Sheryl are leading in place and with communities. So I'd like to introduce the panel. So we have with us today Michael Hogan, who many of you will know, who is the convener of Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. We also have Associate Professor Sally Staton from the Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. We have Sheryl Bachelor, who you heard from for our beautiful acknowledgement, who's the founder and director of Yiliyapinya Indigenous Corporation. And we have Lorna McGinnis joining us today as well from Gladstone Region, engaging in action together. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Michael, who's going to begin his presentation. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you again, Sheryl, for that powerful acknowledgement of country. Can I also acknowledge that I have the privilege of living and working on the lands of the Turrbal people here in Meanjin in Brisbane. I'm just going to spend a few minutes and a few slides just helping to set the context for the webinar today, explaining who Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is and where this initiative sits. Some of you may have heard or know about Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. We're a Queensland-based and focused systems intermediary and coalition. We're hosted by ARACI, the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, and we bring a focus on systems with those 6 systems levers that you just saw in the slides. there, which hopefully coming back. Thanks, Julia. So those systems levers are the lens through which we endeavour to bring people together, bring knowledge, and leaders and practitioners and researchers together to actually shift some of the settings and conditions in our systems that either enable or hold some of the challenges we deal with in place. None of that work would be possible without the partners and collaborators and networkers, a few of whom you're going to hear from today, Sheryl, Sally and Lorna, and hundreds of other organisations and leaders who are engaging with us. So big thank you to them. And none of this would also be possible without the support of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, one of our core and our largest funder for this phase of Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, and the 6 other philanthropies who are supporting us, and all of the in-kind and other contributions we're gathering from people in our government agencies and authorities, not-for-profits, our institutes and philanthropies. So thank you to everybody. On the right of the slide there, you'll see a really little summary of the 10 initiatives that Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership is leading and facilitating in this 3-year phase 2. The Brain Builders Initiative is one of those 10 initiatives, and I want to draw your attention to all of those because all of them are interconnected and they all complement and supplement each other. So if you're interested in finding out more about Thriving Kids, I'm not going to say much more now about what else we're doing, but there's a link, a web address there. There's a link on there, and we're really happy to take questions or comments or follow up anyone who's interested in the rest of what we're doing. So thanks. Next slide, please. So we are endeavouring in Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership to give life to the adage about making the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So we're a backbone team for collaborative systems level work. And the power of what we are enabled to do is actually by the work of leaders and practitioners across our ecosystem. It's a very busy sort of picture. It tries to describe in one slide our ecosystem, our community, our theory of change. And you can see sort of toward the right-hand side of that slide there, our focus is on solutions that build connections, capabilities, and capacities across communities, across services and across systems, so that they are better equipped, better stewarded and working well together, in order that they have impacts on the key domains of what we know it takes for children to thrive. Now, if you just think about that ecosystem in this context of this webinar today, if you sort of go to the middle of the slide, you see that little sort of grassy green 9 boxes there, not-for-profits, governments, universities, corporates, philanthropies, First Nations, places, practitioners, and so on. When you think about it, that's tens of thousands of people in Queensland alone who are shaping the lives of Queensland children, young people, and their caregivers. That's thousands of brains. And all of those folks bring varying levels of knowledge, understanding of the sort of science and knowledge and experience we're going to share with you today. They bring different language, they have different levels of understanding, and they have different misconceptions, or sometimes called neuromyths, brain myths, and they bring different mindsets. So we think it's incredibly important that we focus on what can we do to shift those mindsets and those understandings using neuroscience as not a silver bullet, but as one of the universal human experiences to help sort of bring about the sort of changes we're looking to bring about in our ecosystem. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. So we do start with some core foundational frames, and we know a lot, of course, about what it takes for children and young people to thrive, and many of you will be familiar with the NEST, Australia's Child and Youth Wellbeing Outcomes Framework, developed by RACI some years ago now. And the power of that is it brings a holistic, ecological, developmental and a systemic approach. And that's really our starting frame for Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. And we know it, as well that that's expressed in the lives and the brains and the bodies of children and young people. We know that what surrounds us, what happens to us, who surrounds us, they're the things that shape children's lives. And of course, that also means what children and how children are seen and heard. And we want to share with you one of the two powerful videos that Emerging Minds, one of our partners, have produced that tries to put our language and frames in the context of what children need from us. So could you pass to the video, please? Folks, this will take a couple of seconds to load, but please enjoy.
When you look at me, what do you see? My behavior, my emotions, my interactions. And when you help me, what do you respond to? I am my community. I am my family. I am my country. I am the dances of many countries. I am my traditions. I am 60,000 years old. Are you curious about these things? Do you wonder how this picture was painted? I am my people's laughter. I am my family's resilience. I am my people's history. I am my ancestors. I am my people's struggle. I am my dreaming. I am my language. I am my culture. I am learning in two worlds. I am deadly. I am proud. I am an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child. I am the future.
Thanks very much. I imagine, like I do, every time I see that video, it gives me goosebumps. Really grateful to the Emerging Minds partners and to, of course, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families who participated in that video and helped us see the whole child. You also might have seen and heard that young narrator say, I am my family's resilience. And we think that's one of the other really powerful frames and tools. So the emerging science of resilience is something that we are looking to operationalize in all of our work, along with the nest. We are very committed to using who and what we have and what we hear and learn, that synthesis of evidence, experience, and expertise that tells us now so much about resilience is one of the frames and tools we're looking to sort of activate across our ecosystem. Thanks, Julia. Next slide. One of the things that we identified early on in the development of Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, and it still sort of astounds us, is that no Australian jurisdiction, in fact, we haven't found too many anywhere globally, has a coherent and contemporary and evidence and experience-informed statement about the core capabilities for thriving that we know from both lived experience, from common sense, and from science, the things that we need to thrive as human beings. And so we do have an agenda. We are on a mission to push our systems and for every interaction to be explicit and intentional and purposeful about what those capabilities are for thriving. And to know about those and understand those capabilities, we need to know the science of why and how and what. And that takes us really to trying to describe some of the vital signs of a well-connected and capable system. So next slide, please, Julia. Thank you. And so here's a number of, I guess, key core concepts that we hold very dear in our work with the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, the sort of vital signs that we want. Some of these will be familiar to you. Some of them will resonate with you. We've just had a session this morning, a briefing with government agencies in Queensland about which ones of these resonate most. And so we're on a journey to try and lift capability and understanding across each of these concepts, and in particular, how do we take what we know about them into what we do in our ecosystem, and hence I'm going to hand over to Sally now, and hence our journey. Next slide, please, Julia. And hence our journey around mobilising and operationalising the neuroscience, not because it's a silver bullet, but because it is essential to understanding those capabilities. It is essential to understanding what happens to us, who's around us, the context and ecologies and environments and systems that we live and work on, how they shape us. So we want everyone in that ecosystem that I mentioned before to be a brain builder, all of us. And we're really thrilled to have, as you can see from the logos that we've collected on this slide, the collaborations and partners who have engaged so far. So not only is this a call to all of us to be brain builders, but it's actually a call also for partners and collaborators. So if you're in one of the organisations who haven't yet sort of become engaged, I'm sure there are others, folks who are participating in some of the initiatives Sally's going to talk about in a moment, but we'd love to hear and see you. And so please get in touch with us following the webinar or in the chat, in the Q&A, so that if you're interested to get engaged, then we'd love to hear from you. Sally, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Next slide, please. So I'm Sally Staton. I'm an associate professor in child development at the Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. So I just wanted to sort of give some context of my own background, just because I think it positions where we've taken this work, and we were really pleased when Michael approached and told us about what he was trying to do, and got very excited about this. And just in terms of my own interest in child development, I've been a researcher for about 15 years in this space, mostly looking at birth to 5 children. But I feel like my interest in child development emerged much earlier than this. I am the mother of an early childhood teacher. I'm the father, I'm not the mother, I'm the daughter of an early childhood teacher. My father was a chemist, so I feel like I've just brought the two things together with science in child development. But one of the stories I'd love to share is that early on in my life, every meal that we ever had at night, my mother would come back from teaching young children and she would tell what we referred to as her magic moments, where every single day the children that she worked would have incredible leaps in their development that would just fill her with awe and wonder. And I think that was always instilled with me. So when Michael brought this project to us and our team, and we had the privilege of hearing about the ambition for this project, one of the things that really struck me was the possibility of sharing not only the things that are negative that affect children's lives and that we have to be deeply aware of and deeply supporting, but also that opportunity to instill that awe and wonder in people about how amazing what happens to children and young people is across those early years of development and through their adolescence and indeed throughout our lives. I was really excited about that possibility. Oh, sorry, next slide. Thank you. So the Thriving Kids Brain Builders Initiative is launched by Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, but we are both the knowledge and translation partners that help support that in collaboration, as Michael said, with a huge number of partnerships across government, non-government organisations, advocacy groups and practitioners. And that's really vital to the work that we're trying to achieve. The aims of the project are obviously to build widespread neuroscience understanding of children and young people and what we refer to as neuro-informed practice, which I'm going to explain a little bit during the next few minutes. To build capabilities, to actually embed it. So it's one thing knowing, but moving from knowing to embedding means that we need to have tools and resources and a really good understanding of some of those barriers and potential enablers across the system to allow us to get into places, spaces and workforces and support the incredible work they do. And acknowledgement of that work and that it's not about trying to fix work, but strengthen and support that as best as possible. And to do that, we obviously need to leverage the amazing expertise to enable that large-scale and sustainable practice and system change. I guess at its core, Brain Builders is really about developing a shared knowledge, a shared language and shared messages that we can all use, whether we're thinking vertically from very high levels of government all the way through to the people on the ground and in fact children themselves, or thinking horizontally from or across all the different sectors and fields that work with children and young people so that we can help catalyse that sort of big vision of systems change. If you want to learn more about Brain Builders, there is a QR code there and a link. So for us, thank you, next slide. You timed that beautifully. For us, brain building is really about a couple of things. First, it's about going on to the how we do things. We can all do things in different ways, and there is no one right way to do something or to support children and families. There are certainly evidence-based ways, but depending on where you are working in a system, that is going to look different. What we feel is universal is the why we do things. And if we can understand why we're doing that, we can both strengthen what we're already doing, but also consider new opportunities and ways of doing that we maybe haven't thought of before that are informed by deep evidence and understanding of how our brains work and how we develop as humans. So this, as I said, is not about fixing a deficit in workforces, but really reinforcing and strengthening the incredible work that is already going on in workforces, but addressing one of the key barriers that is often raised, which is that integration across workforces and how we can work together. It's about that common language, knowledge and messaging. At its heart is really about putting the child at the centre and in fact the brain of the child at the centre, but that's really, I'll explain in a moment, but that's really important that that's not seen in isolation, but within context. And finally, brain building is really about considering that we are all brain builders, that we have a collective responsibility. And yes, we may influence children and young people in different ways, but we are all playing a part in building a young person's brain and therefore who they are, their identity and their life. So neuro-informed policy and practice, one of the things that we've had to do really early on is make sure we're really clear on what we mean by this. You may not have heard of neuro-informed policy and practice before. It's something that's emerged over probably the last 2 decades since there was a seminal work around the year 2000 called Neurons to Neighbourhoods. And it really shifted people's thinking to say that neuroscience wasn't about the cells in the brain in isolation, but that understanding could help us inform policy and practice all the way through to the systems or society levels. So there's been a real shift and widening of the frame of understanding of neuroinformed practice from the brain in isolation. What do we do to make kids learn better, etc. That's important, but it's not really the key of what neuroinformed policy and practice is. Thinking about the interactions between the brain and the body, again, really, really important, but it's not the whole picture. And the real frame that we're interested in is the brain and the body and the person in the context of the life that they live and the many, many aspects of that. So neuroinformed policy and practice as a definition is about translating and applying current evidence from neuroscience and the related fields that work around neuroscience about the processes underpinning human development and behaviour that can help us guide policy and practice actions. Next slide, please. And most importantly, the intent of neuroinformed policy and practice is really to create and promote optimal conditions for brain health. Now, I always say that the first time I heard about brain health, I had a bit of a moment and said, oh, how do I feel about this idea of brain health? Because I don't want to go around thinking there's unhealthy and healthy brains, or having this idea that we're classifying people's brains. Once I actually became familiar, however, with the World Health Organization's understanding of brain health, I felt a lot more comfortable in this space. So brain health is defined by the World Health Organization as the state of brain functioning across cognitive, social, emotional behaviour and motor domains, and it's what allows a person to realise their full potential over their life course. And this is irrespective of the presence or absence of disorders. So this is not about creating, an ultimate human or people that are the same, but actually allowing each person the right and the opportunity to thrive, and whatever that means to them. So for neuroinformed, it's about achieving brain health, but it's also the related positive physical, social and community outcomes that we know comes with allowing children and young people and all of us to thrive. Next slide, please. So from that, and out of the big scoping review that we've just finished in this space, to make that nice and clear, there are really 12 key knowledge bases that underpin neuroinformed policy and practice. I won't go into each of them, but you can see that they range from understanding of brain development and key messages around brains being built over time and not just born, through to the whole person. So understanding that interaction between the person with their immediate relationships, with their families, communities, and in the system and the social context in which they live. Next slide, please. So Thriving Kids Brain Builders Initiative has 6 key components. So we have our brain building modules, Deadly Brains, which Sheryl is going to speak more about, and that's led by Sheryl and Yiliyapinya. Brain Healthy Places and Spaces, which are working with our in-place initiatives. Brain Builders Communities of Practice, the Brain Trust Collaborative, and Brain Building Workforces. Again, you can learn more about those here. Next slide. And just to give you a few examples of some of the things that we've been doing in this first 12 months of this work, we've worked with Emerging Minds and Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership to develop the foundational modules which provide understanding of brain development for children and young people that can be applied across different workforces and are freely available. And there's a link there if you'd like to engage with those. And our next step is that we've received funding to now focus in on additional resource development, specifically focused on the early child workforce, including thinking about what underpins our knowledge and understanding for the 5 AEDC indicators, which we know are really important for those working across the system. Next slide, please. We've also been developing tools and resources, not disregarding what's out there. A really key component of this is actually using what we already have in the system and not reinventing wheels, but thinking about how we can bring these in and together to create resources that are relevant across systems and roles, that are no or very low cost to the end user. That's a really key, important part of what we do, that are really underpinned by science and current science and evidence, that allow people to learn, to share experiences and also apply that understanding to their practice and draw from key frameworks. So this is just an example of one of those resources we've been developing, which is the Resilience Game, and that draws from the Harvard Resilience Scale, the Alberta Resilience Tools, the Race Ness Wellbeing Framework, the UNICEF's What Makes Me framework, and the adverse childhood experiences and positive and adverse child experience evidence base that's sitting there. And so this is some of the piloting that we've been doing there. There, you can go to the next slide, that's fine, thanks. We've also got our communities of practice up and running. This was originally intended to be 30 people. We had over 300 in the end people register to be part of our initial communities practice. We ended up having to do multiple. We're also doing some bespoke ones. And that's bringing people from across the system together to share and build understanding of brains and community, brains and health, brains and learning, brains and behaviour. Next slide, thanks. We've also been running events. So we had our annual Brain Builder Summit last year, which was hosted by Norman Swan, which was amazing to bring in leaders from across the system in all different areas to talk about what is brain building and how do we go from knowledge to action. We've had implementation workshops of working on and thinking about how we move again from knowledge to action. We have an education event coming up later in the year, and we'll have our second summit mid this year. And we're also running regional events with some of our key partners from across Queensland around this area, and there's been great interest in that, which has been wonderful. Last slide, I think. So just to finish off, to say that whilst we have, you know, our core brain builders, there has been from this a whole range of projects that have begun to emerge. So Thriving Kids Active Brains is funded by the Ian Potter Foundation as an extension of this beautiful piece of work that's already in action to focus on early child development sectors. We're working with the State Library around some work to do with the First Five Forever program, working with the Department of, with our early childhood partners around food for thought and thinking about how we provide for food for the benefit of children's brains in places and spaces to thrive, which is a work that was approached and brought to us to work with architects about how we create brain healthy places for children. We have Families in Focus, which is working with our hospitals around and directly consulting with children and families who are experiencing chronic illness or disability, and also a brain health in schools program that's emerged out of this. So really excited about that. And underpinning that, of course, as researchers, we always have continual knowledge generation that we're undertaking. I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much. And I'll pass on to Sheryl. Oh, no, sorry, Lorna.
Michelle. Thanks, Sally.
Oh, Michelle, thank you.
Thanks, Sally. So some really great evidence of what's happening through Brain Builders Initiative. And I think the video that Michael shared is something that, you know, really resonates. Every time we see that and we share that video, it really resonates with folks in the room. Next slide, please, Julia. And we know that while programmatic interventions help people beat the odds, systemic interventions actually change their odds. So when we think about those children in the video, what we're really working to do is to translate this evidence into practice and to be able to change the odds for children and young people. So we're going to have a look now at what this actually is looking like in practice, how it's being translated on the ground and literally changing the odds for children. And I'm going to pass first of all to Lorna McGinnis, who is the Executive Director of Gladstone Region Engagement Action Together, which is a place-based initiative, and she's going to share how they've been translating this to build workforce capability across their system. Thanks, Lorna.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today to share the Childhood Builders series, training series that's about to occur in Gladstone and how that's come about. So thanks for the introduction, Michelle. Lorna McGinnis from Gladstone in central Queensland, about 6 hours north of Brisbane. If you haven't visited, please do. Southern end of the Great Barrier Reef, amazing community. And I would also like to acknowledge our traditional owners here as well, our Gureng, Bayali and Turrbal Bunda people. And to extend respect, following on from others, to all of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across our lands. Thank you. So we are a Stronger Places, Stronger People demonstration community in Gladstone. So part of the national program, we're one of 10 demonstration communities. So our partners are Australian and Queensland government, and we also have a partnership with our local council and many organisations, both state, national, but very much locally, given that we are place-based and community-led. So our social sector and my colleague, Courtney Morrison, who's also online, have been designing, developing and working with the partners that you're hearing from today to develop the Childhood Builders training series in Gladstone. We first of all heard from our community that in terms of lived experience and what was needed locally, there was a real strain on community around disjointedness in the system. So while we have a very passionate social sector, very committed and dedicated individuals who I am in awe of, what our families and children were saying was that just the continuity of care that they're experiencing across the different services that were there to support them had some challenges, and they were finding it hard to navigate the support system and also sort of finding it hard to understand between different referrals what their role was and what the right next steps were in that process. They also told us about long wait times. And there was a real feeling from community that we need more of a proactive and strengths-based approach to supports for families in our region, really building on the strengths that exist here locally, but also building on the individual strengths and really focused on what you've heard about today around that, increasing the opportunity for every individual to reach their unique and individual capacity. So following on from what we heard from community, we spoke to our social sector providers and they reflected very similar experience and understanding of the challenges locally. The long wait times, the wait lists that were being experienced, that some of them referred to the inefficient referrals process. So where there was a catch-22, that the wrong referrals were coming to organisations and were just exasperating the wait lists and preventing that quality, right service, right time delivery to our local community members, particularly our families and children, which for GRT is our main focus. So we're mostly interested, although we look at whole community, we're mostly interested in our young people and really very closely aligned to that racy aspiration of having our young children be loved and thrive in life. So sector worked closely together to identify what the next steps were, a little bit similarly to that, working with the who and what we have. So thinking about the strengths that existing in the system, yes, there were definitely some gaps that were identified, but more importantly, there was an interest in optimizing our service system and really building off those strengths that existed across practitioners and across the services and the quite reasonably resourced social sector that we have locally across the whole human service sector. So not just our social sector, but also our education and our health sector, with a real interest in improving those referrals, diverting some of those incorrect referral processes to the right presentation points, and really being able to support our service sector that were already at their full stretch point to be able to build on the strengths that already existed. So skills shortages in the regions were really being felt in Gladstone, and that capacity of service sector to fill roles and then to upskill practitioners was really being felt. At the same time, the sorts of things that we were hearing was there was a real growing interest and a shared narrative around looking at how neuroscience fitted, how we can build resilience in our families and children. But it was also clear that there wasn't really a shared understanding across all of our service providers about what that meant. So that shared practice was an opportunity that sector providers said to us, we really want to focus on this. We really think we can create some amazing outcomes if we can just get that support to work together more collaboratively. So identifying that there were sort of three core areas and again, really resonated when I heard that capacity, capability and connection piece. That was really where our sector were highlighting to us that they needed the support. So super busy, working long hours, giving everything they could, but just couldn't keep up to the demand. And really conscious of the fact that while they were trying their best to work with others, there was a bit of siloing and a disjointedness happening across that service provision. So three key goals around capacity building from the inside of sector to meet the changing and growing needs, particularly around things like children's behaviours and that beautiful video earlier around, you know, what do you see when you see us? What do you hear when you listen to us? So being holistic in the approach, being person-centred and child-centred, hearing children and seeing children, but also really improving that collaboration and understanding of the entire system through shared language, knowledge and messages like Sally spoke about, but also, you know, that shared model, practice and application, the tools. And so very early on, the Aracy Common Approach and the nest became a real fantastic anchor point for our community to start to have those conversations about what does continuity of care look like, what does shared practice and language look like. And we tested that quite early last year with a few of our local network, service sector network champions, by having them go through the training, the Common Approach training. And at that same time, that again, that continued kind of trending of conversation around neuroscience and resilience was just sort of building and growing. So more and more of our workshops, engagements and working groups were sort of having those similar conversations. So when we first started this conversation about bringing the pieces together of the resilience scale, the neuroscience pieces, the online components, the Common Approach, everything just fell into place really neatly. And our service sector are hugely excited at the moment that this is something that's going to be brought to Gladstone. The other thing that was really fantastic as part of that co-design methodology was that our service sector were heard really strongly in the fact that you know, they kind of acknowledged and were astute enough, sophisticated enough to understand that sometimes they go to these amazing training opportunities and then it all sort of dies a death. And if I can very boldly share with you, they referenced it as the training orgasm, where it's an amazing outcome at the end, but sort of forgotten about the next day in terms of embedding practice. And so this training that has been co-designed not only brings together those three critical pieces, but it looks at how can we actually deliver that over time in a number of different methodologies and also provide the tools and practices so that it can be continued and sustained in practice. So we are very grateful on behalf of our community, very grateful to these stakeholders that have come together to support our social sector in enabling that. And we've got great belief that that learning and understanding together through this method is going to shape collective practice for us to change the whole system locally. So thank you for your support and thanks everybody for your attention today.
Thanks, Lorna. And I have to say, we're so grateful for Gladstone Region engaging in action together. Your engagement with this and the way that yourself and your team and Courtney in particular have really led, you know, bringing this into action for your system. And we're incredibly excited. I know all of the partners are incredibly excited to see what it looks like. So just for some context for people who potentially may want to know a little bit more about what that's going to look like. So that will be a partnership. So it's between Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership and Aracy and Yiliyapinya. So on the first day, day one, we're going to do a brain health and common approach and nest training day, which will look at wellbeing conversations. How do we fit this around the ecological model? And what does this actually mean in terms of how we interact in the day-to-day? And the second day is a partnership with Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. And we're going to be delving deeper into the resilience scale. So we're going to be sharing a brand new animation, which is in process right now, which is bringing together the nest, the elements of the nest, along with the resilience scale. And during that day, we're actually going to have a chance to play some of those games that QBI have been developing that you saw on the slides earlier, and really delving deeper. What does this look like on an individual, an organisation and a system level? And exactly as Lorna said, in a way that it's not just a one-off. How do we actually build this so that capacity building is sustained and really empowers the individuals and the organisations and the system after that professional development has finished? So thank you so much, Lorna and Gladstone, for your work and your engagement with that piece of work so far. Okay, another piece of incredible work, and of course one of the partners who's working with us within Gladstone is the work of Yiliyapinya Indigenous Corporation and the incredible work of Sheryl Bachelor, who many of you will have seen and heard of the incredible work that she's doing. I know that in organising this webinar, a couple of people spoke how highly they found Sheryl's presentation and how useful the presentation last year was. So Sheryl, I'm going to pass to you for you to share some of the incredible work that you're doing, translating this into action as well. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just call up the slide, that would be awesome. I've just got one slide and I just would like us just to stop for a moment and just take a nice deep breath. We've heard lots of things so far, but I'm going to go down even further and say, what does this actually look like on the ground for practitioners, for teachers, for the workforce? And one of the things that I've learned over these years from lots and lots of children and families is the workforce matters. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to talk about a play group we have running, teaching parents about brain development. And then I'll talk about the yearly program, which is for our most vulnerable children and families. So first of all, about the workforce. What you see in front of you is a little graph of what we've done is looking at over 1,100 people in the helping profession. So these are adults who could be educators, child safety workers, youth justice workers, Queensland police workers. And what they engaged in was what's called a brain health screener. And a brain health screener is an online set of activities that looks at your cognitive skills, but it also asks you a series of questions that are measuring your protective factors of brain health. And that's something we don't tend to think about. What is our protective factors of brain health that we should be thinking about as we get older, as well as what sorts of things the children should be doing to make sure that their brains stay healthy. And, for example, we know physical exercise, nutrition, and having really healthy relationships, or knowing that you've got someone that you can have a yarn to when you need to. So as I said, over 1,100 people did this activity on the computer. And if you have a look at processing speed, you can see a bit of a bell curve there if you sort of turn it 90 degrees. And the long bar shows how many people. So you can see that's probably pretty good. Most people's processing speed is good. So that's an indicator of the myelation around their connection. So that's actually really good. But check out working memory. Working memory, over 750 people were 1 to 2 standard deviations below where they should be for an adult in their working memory. So I'd like you to think about that for a moment. And feel free to put your comments in the chat here. What does that mean? What it means is that myself as a teacher, that when I'm asked a question and I'm listening to a child's response, I'm probably going to miss things. And not only am I going to miss things, but my brain's such a very good predicting machine that it's going to predict what the answer should probably be. So, for example, I might say to my class, we're going to do page 63, exercise 7. And my working memory is not there. I could say to myself, oh, Miss said page 63, must be number 6 because that's what we did yesterday. So I'm going to go and do number 6. And the child will think, oh, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm all good. And then the teacher would come over and go, what are you doing? What should you be doing? What are you going to do about it? And how does the child feel? I just heard you say this, miss. So what does that mean for the child if their working memory is not well? But let's just take it from the other angle. The child's telling you a story, and this usually happens for us teachers, particularly after morning tea, when the children come back after break time and they tell you all these different stories. If our working memory is not all that good, we're going to miss things. We're going to miss things like people's names, the whereabouts of an incident, what's happened, who was involved. So let's take that out further to workers, child protection workers, teachers, police officers, educators, parents, children. So if the brain health of the workforce is not healthy, there's a disruptive communication in that relationship. So the health of our workforce is really important. So we do brain health in schools. And we have a really wonderful project at the moment that we're very grateful for, that we're working with over 70 child safety workers, and we're taking them on a brain health and healing journey over 6 months. So we're looking at their brain health before, where they are in a moment in time, improving their brain health by coaching and supervision over a 6-month period, and then doing this again and seeing if focusing on improving our own brain health and being aware of that makes a difference to how we practice and how we feel about our job. Because we know this workforce is tricky and we get very stressed, but if we don't have a healthy brain ourselves, it's going to impact our own relationships, but also in the workforce. The second one is Deadly Brains Playgroup. In this particular playgroup, it's pretty awesome. We've been doing it now for about 4 or 5 years, and we're teaching parents exclusively about children's brain development across the lifespan. So not just for their little people who they have there, but also adult brain health. And we talk about the impact of hormones on our brain and how that changes women's brains and men's brains in sometimes positive and sometimes negative neuroplasticity. So people love learning about their brains. And it's just so cute, little people running around saying, this is my brain, and it's happy or it's sad. And so teaching kids about their brain development is pretty awesome. And the outcomes that we've got from this is that parents are saying that they feel empowered, that they understand why their children are doing what they're doing, and that it's about developmental milestones, no matter whether they're 2 or 10 or 11. So they understand that when they understand their own brain, then you're better able to support and help others. So our playgroup's pretty popular. And then the next one that I want to talk about and spend a little bit of time on is the yearly program. And the yearly program is looking at our most vulnerable children. And these are children aged between 10 to 17. However, we have a 9-year-old at the moment. They're completely disengaged from school. And some of them haven't been to school for a year or 2. So let's just think about that for a moment. A child hasn't been to school for nearly 2 years and they're 9. They're usually in both systems, the youth justice system and the child protection system. So let's think about this in regards to what's happening in their brain and what's happening in my brain when I talk to them. And how can I help them when they're so traumatized and distressed that they cannot have their needs met in the normal mainstream and education or alternative systems. And particularly in primary school, where we don't have alternative schools for our primary school children. So I'd like you to think about a child that we have, and feel free to write some comments down in the chat here. I'm thinking about a young person that we're supporting at the moment. He's 11, so that means he's in year 6. He lives in residential care by himself because of his violence and sexual connotations between his siblings. His dad is in prison for domestic violence. He has attempted suicide twice. Very low attendance at school for a number of years. He's now excluded. He's now excluded to the point where we've had leaders in the education system ask us, can you take this child on 5 days a week while we find him a school? Let's think about that for a moment. He's 11 and is excluded from school. I wonder how the brain health of the staff at the school were feeling when this child was distressed. Feel free to write down any notes. I wonder if their brain health, their working memory, their frustration, their cognitive skills were being challenged to the point where they found it difficult to interpret the messages and behaviours that this child was experiencing. And that they were so distressed that they were taking it personally. Whereas what I see is a very distressed brain, a very traumatised brain that needs a lot of support. So let's have a think about what systems are around this child. We have child safety. We have the residential care workers. We have schools in effect. We need to get him back to a school. We have youth justice. There's a whole number of systems around this family and child. Each one of them are individual brains in the workforce. How are we supporting them to help the child and the family? One of the things that we're doing here is that we're working with child safety by doing our brain health workforce. with the child safety workers, but also with the residential care facility where the child is in, the youth workers come and stay. So we're teaching them about brain development. We're teaching them about what's going on for this child. We're teaching them in the moment and mentoring and that support. So they're doing the same things that we are in helping co-regulation and everything. But also when the child says my brain's going nuts, then the youth workers know what that means. So what we're wanting from this child is we want attachment to the siblings. It's very sad at the moment that we're seeing lots of siblings come to our place to work on improving their brain health and healing. And as I said, we want to be able to help this young person heal his brain. We want to be able to help him improve his brain, not only those protective factors, but which we know culture is a massive protective factor, but it's not the only one, but also about the relationships, about the environment. We run our program from a football club. So it's very healing in regards to we see beautiful greenery everywhere. And we do all the other things that we know from science to help improve the brain, such as things like equine therapy, social emotional learning around the National Social Emotional Wellbeing Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But we do a lot of neuroplasticity programs and strategies and integrate that into our service delivery. So the kids do cognitive training and the kids do the physical exercises that we know from science improve executive function. So they're not just doing a sport, there's actually a science behind what we're doing. So we're bringing that neuroscience and culture together. And of course, our wonderful healing. Did you know that the didgeridoo has the vibrations that resonate with you really right down to your cells, and listening and really focusing on that can be so calming for your spirit. And when I'm talking about our spirit, I'm talking about our brain, our heart, and our gut. So our Indigenous ways of healing is also based on neuroscience principles, but there's some other things that we can add into it. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that you can do something right now about improving your own brain health, but more importantly is improving the people that are around you's brain health. But it has to start with awareness. So the brain health screening that we do for the workforce, as well as for the children, as well as for the families, as well as for the mums and dads, creates the awareness where we can have that conversation about protective factors and also about what we can do to improve our brain health. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Otherwise, I think I might pass it over to Michael or Michelle.
Thanks, Sheryl. Sheryl, every time I hear you speak, and every time I learn more about your work, it just gets me deeper and deeper. And I think the impact on so many young people's lives, we know the impact that this has on young people. And I think the work that you're doing on the ground with these young people, it's not a statistic. It's not a random, theory. These are young people. That little boy you spoke about, tried to commit suicide twice. How can we change the odds for these young people? How can we, integrate into the system? How can we change things so we're not having these same conversations in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time? So thank you for sharing that, Sheryl, and thank you for all that you're doing to create change for young people and to support that change for young people. And thank you to all of our panelists for the expertise and wisdom that you've shared today. So we're going to open up to a panel discussion, and then we're going to come to questions from participants. So I'd just like to ask the panel to begin with, what does this mean? How can we upscale this? And how can we actually start to change the odds for all children to thrive? Just a small question to begin with.
Michelle, look, I think we've heard today, from Sally and Lorna and Sheryl, that we actually need a multifaceted, systemic, coordinated approach to uplifting capabilities across our workforces and our organisations and our systems. As Sheryl reminds us a lot, unless workers have the permission and the space and the support to actually, spend time on this amongst all of the other demands and priorities and expectations and accountabilities, then we can't equip them to do the best that they want to do. So we are, apart from, wanting to expand and scale the sort of work Sheryl's doing at Yili and Deadly Play groups and so on, and we have got a proposition if anyone's interested in that Sheryl has developed together with us and QATSIP, the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection peak body, to grow deadly brains. How do we take that knowledge and approach that Sheryl's outlined for us to scale in our ecosystem, and then potentially, nationally? So we're very keen to, bring other collaborators and partners on board to do what we've heard today, to do more of what Lorna has described is going to do, to amplify and accelerate what Sally's team is doing with lots of partners and collaborators. That's what we're hoping to do as we go forward with the Thriving Kids Brain Builders Initiative.
Thanks, Michael. Do any of the other panel want to add to that?
I'll just add, I know I've mentioned it already, but just to share the excitement that's being held locally about this opportunity. It's like a long-awaited need that's going to be met locally to have that shared language around a model that people already are using and interested in. So we're hoping that this is just sort of the first pebble in the pond for the ripples for our local community and to spread throughout our region in Central Queensland, because we're really conscious that continuity of care in one location isn't sufficient. We've got families and children that move between different locations in Central Queensland and wider. And so we really would love to think that those children, those families now that might be getting their first experience of hearing about well-being and brain health will go on to continue to hear that in other locations. So it's something that they can feel confident and comfortable with as well. So that's our aim. We're hoping the excitement here and the outcomes that we'll achieve here will also encourage others to invest that time, which I know is such a hard thing to do. But the value proposition will be very clear, we hope, after we roll this out in Gladstone.
Thanks, Lorna. We've got a question in the chat, and I do encourage everyone who's online today, please do put your questions into the chat using the question and answer function that we've got there today. This is your chance to ask the panel the questions that you've got on your mind, and the chances are, if you're thinking something, nothing's too silly to ask, nothing's a small question. If you've got a wondering, there'll be somebody else online who is thinking potentially similar. So our first question we've got, and Sally, I think I'm going to target this one to you, is what would I learn in the foundational modules, and who is the target audience?
Thanks, Michelle. Look, I'll answer the second one first. So the target audience for these modules is deliberately broad. So as I said, often when we're doing work in translation research, we're thinking about one field or one, we work with health, we work with education, we work with social services or a particular workforce. One of the challenges with this, but also one of the opportunities with this piece of foundational work that we've been doing, is to think about what are the messages that we can have and the knowledge that could go across. So there's 4 parts to our Understanding Brain Development modules that Emerging Minds have developed. The first thing tells us about brain architecture and how brains are built. And so it has levels of that. It has the core messages that brains built over time, like a house, all of those sorts of things that have come through from the Frameworks Institute, from Harvard, that are being used elsewhere, such as Alberta and Oxford. But it also then allows people to go into the understanding, to build the knowledge of what does that mean in terms of understanding how neurons and cells, develop over time, from conception all the way through our early childhood, and indeed continue to be developing and influenced by environments across time. So that's sort of one bit of it, and that's the first module is really about that understanding of how brains develop. What are sensitive periods? We have particular sensitive periods for neuroplasticity, but also that we have neuroplasticity throughout our lives. And so we have opportunities to actually change trajectories for children and young people. And then if people wish to engage, go down and actually really understand how that works inside the brain. The second part, or the second module, is around trauma and adversity and how stress influences the brain. There's a huge amount of literature and evidence that's come through over many, many years about the interaction between our brain and our body and the adversities that we face and what that means for children and young people in terms of not just affecting their emotions, but also affecting their health, affecting their learning, affecting, their physical development, all of those sorts of things. The third thing is really shifting then to what are the ways that we can support healthy brain development. Now, we have a really relational focus to our foundational module. That was from the co-design, and the feedback we got was that it was really important that we ground this. There's all sorts of things we talk about when we talk about brains, but relationships are really, really key to all the workforces and that we work with. And so it's really looking at what are the relational things, the serve and return type of interactions, and what happens for children when that occurs. Thinking about differences in pathways of development for different children, that we have to respond in different ways. So really thinking about neurodiversity within that, but also just individual differences and some of the other actions that we can do for children and young people. So examples of things like the physical activity, sleep, and some of these sort of environmental things that might influence brain health. And the final module is really about application. So it's really taking some of those key learnings, such as trauma-informed practice, how you respond to children when they raise things and talk to children, include children in decision-making, bringing all some of those key messages in, things like well-beingness, to actually think about, once we have that neuroscience, these frameworks are based on evidence. They don't come out of thin air. They actually align really beautifully. How can we bring those together to think about application and encourage application into practice? Sorry, that was probably a very long answer.
No, that was great, Sally. Thank you. And I've just popped into the chat the link to the modules, and it's just worth emphasising that they are completely free, which is thanks due to our philanthropic partners such as Paul Ramsay Foundation. The modules have been funded to be able to support workforce capability and capacity development without fee. So please jump on and have a look at those modules. Because of the way they've been funded and set up as well, we're working at the moment with partner organisations to actually use the assets, the key pieces of those modules, to embed into different organisation learning management systems that are really tailored for their audience and for their workforces. So if you lead an organisation and you are interested in that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. These modules are there. There's some really great content, and they're there to be shared across the ecosystem to support workforce. I'm going to pass to the panel. Have you got any questions that you'd like to ask, potentially of one another, or to put forward for discussion? Sheryl.
I've got one. I would like to ask the audience, how is their brain health? And how do they know that it's healthy or unhealthy?
This is a great question, Sheryl. So if you could pop into the chat, how is your brain health?
Yeah, how's your brain going? How is your brain health? Like, I can get on the scales at home and find out how much I weigh, and that can give me a bit of an idea of how my brain and my body and what I need to do to get physically fit and eat and everything. But what about your brain? How is your brain? And how do you know that your brain's okay or not okay?
Any brave folks out there? Hired, someone said.
Yeah.
I reckon that'll be echoed across it.
Yep.
Frazzled.
So does that mean that your brain is healthy or unhealthy, or okay or not okay? Mine is like optimal currently, and I know that impacts my ability to self-regulate when grieving and stressed. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. Unhealthy. And I think this is it, is that when we're talking about brain health, is that we have to be vulnerable. And this whole thing that we're learning about in regards to neuroscience and everything, it really makes us come back and be very vulnerable about our own, I suppose, health and it might not be something that we like to talk about. It's like we don't like to talk about our age and our weight. Some of us don't like to talk about that, you know, like I'm tired, I'm feeling unhealthy, I'm not eating properly, I'm over drinking, or, you know, whatever that is. But most of the time, we don't know how our brain health is, because there's nothing out there that allows us to measure that. Unless you go to your doctor and you say things are going great, and then they can look at medical things, or they can say, maybe pop out and see a psychologist and get a psychometric assessment done, where you can get some sort of diagnosis or, you know, something. But there's nothing that's a screener there for our brain health. And I think most of us aren't thinking about it.
I completely agree, Sharon, and I think, and thanks to those of you who have popped into the question and answer box. So the chat is disabled, but you can pop any questions or any comments into the question and answer function. And I think what's come through in the chat, Sheryl, is it's variable. And I think even opening up the discussion and the conversation of asking the question, could you imagine if within every organisation, every workforce, every family, every community, we stop to ask one another, how is your brain health? How many arguments would be, you know, potentially prevented? How many people get into the pointy end? Because often we don't talk about things until they really escalate. So thank you for creating space for that. I'm going to share, this is totally unscripted, but I'm actually going to share an experience of that in practice. And anybody feel free to pop into the question and answer box, anything else that resonates with you with this. So when I moved back to Australia about 5 years ago, I'd been working as a leader in education and supporting teacher trainees with integrating wellbeing into education. We'd worked to create curriculum change for integrating wellbeing into the curriculum and building our professional development to integrate it. So I was seen at the time in my space back in the UK as a leader in that field. And I moved here to Australia and I was working as a curriculum coach and then ended up teaching at a school with a high proportion of children with trauma, and had a really close relationship with our CSO, our child safety officer. And the classroom I was teaching in had no air conditioning. It was incredibly hot Australian summer and high needs within the classroom. And there was a little boy in my class, it was a year 5 class. And I worked really hard to connect with him. I knew how important that connection was. So I worked really hard to build that relationship and build that safety for him. And 9 times out of 10, managed to do it. And we were about in week 7, 8 of term. And anyone who's a teacher knows what that means. Week 7 or 8 is when you've got your assessments coming, you're starting to do reporting. And my brain health really wasn't that great. And I was juggling. And that one day, that little boy who I was normally so good at making the time for came up and wanted to say something. And I had 101 different things to do. And I said that the words that for him with his trauma background meant total rejection. I said, can you please come back in 5 minutes? Because of where he was, because of what happened to him that morning, his mum wasn't on the scene, living with uncle. He'd had a huge morning. That incident ended up escalating, and it actually ended up with, and again, because my brain health wasn't good, and this is something I share, to share that vulnerability and to share that it's okay to not be okay in that moment, rather than being that education leader who knew how to who knew how to de-escalate the situation, who knew how to co-regulate, who knew how important that was in the mirror neurons was. I knew all of that. I'd been leading in that space. In that moment, my lid literally flipped. And in that moment, I escalated that situation. And it resulted in that young lad coming at me with a pair of scissors, and in a situation that could have become really, really gnarly. And for that young lad, meaning that he would have been labelled as, violent, or, a problem, at risk of, suspension and so on. And it sat with me. I knew what he needed. I knew his background, but it sat wider than me because it sat within the system that I was a part of, because it was week 7 and 8. And actually what I had on was more than I could do the system didn't provide the enabling environment to be able to support myself, to support that student at that moment. Now, I was really, really lucky in that we had an incredible wellbeing team, an incredible DP and behaviour lead who came in. We had a really great debrief, which was an ironic debrief because she sat down and said to me, hey, I just want to share with you something called flipping the lid, which may be of interest. And it was a real pertinent moment for me, and it's always stuck with me. I'd gone from leading that, I'd gone from talking about that at conferences to being back on the ground. And in the moment, my prefrontal cortex had come offline and I'd forgotten it. So I guess I share that just with that that opening to please know it's okay to not be okay. But what we really want to do is be opening up the conversations to check in on one another. And when something happens and you're not okay, or a young person's not okay, or maybe a colleague's not okay, to check in and to use that repair and to use that understanding of neuroscience to understand that behaviour is communication and where it comes from. So that was a bit off script.
Michelle, thanks for sharing that real practical and very personal and very powerful example. And, you know, I'm sure that resonated with lots of folks. So when we you know, we're pushing down this track because those incidents and interactions happen every day, in every classroom, in every clinic, in every playgroup, in every playground. Now, of course, we're human, we're not perfect. You know, we don't have, we're not our best every day. But through this sort of initiative, if we can just shift a little bit, the systems and the organisations and the service settings that you and thousands of other practitioners have worked in, if we can just shift them a bit with better knowledge, skills, confidence, then that's the intent of this initiative. It's a lovely way of expressing and making it real because it happens every day.
Thanks, Michael. Are there, before we wrap up, any more questions from participants to come into the chat? Feel free, this is your moment to ask. And again, nothing's a silly question. Please do ask if you've got any others. We've got one question here. Are Queensland local councils being approached to let them know about this work?
I might take that one, Michelle. Lorna did mention earlier that you know, GREAT is linking with Gladstone Council, which is fantastic. One of the key themes that's come out of our work with a related initiative, which is our Thriving Places, Thriving Kids Network, is the importance of local councils playing in this space. Some do, and perhaps not. Some are not yet. So we're going to be very deliberate about working with our collaborators like Lorna, particularly in the place-based initiatives across Queensland, where they're looking for more collaboration and engagement with local councillors and local council staff to really see if we can step that up. So it's a great question, Carly, and we any folks here who live and work in local government land, if you're in the webinar today, we'd love to hear from you too, because we'd love to seek your advice and about the best ways to go about engaging local government. Lorna, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Michael. I was just going to offer, there's an obvious challenge for local governments in understanding their role. I know, different local governments deliver different levels of services in that community space. Some do, some don't. And so I think sometimes the challenge is the understanding of contextually where it fits. But as soon as you start talking about participation, connection in community, why this is so important, not just specific to the early years, but across communities and for our right through to our grandparents and, those people that are volunteering in our community. I think it gets the that little draw card of understanding where it fits in some of that community space for councils as well. I think sometimes it's a challenge for councils to identify where the line is between the service system, the service sector, and where their role starts. But as soon as you start talking civic participation and participation in community life, it seems to be the connection point between the two things, the two worlds.
Thanks, Lorna. And just as an example, we've had a fantastic collaboration with State Library of Queensland, particularly First Five Forever. Sally mentioned that briefly earlier. It's an incredible program across the state of Queensland, engaging thousands and thousands of parents and their kids. And we're really excited about that collaboration. And that's with local libraries. So the stake of local councils through libraries, through sporting clubs, through recreation, through community activities. There are plenty of touch points.
Great. And a linked question, somebody's asked, what are the best ways to involve local government? We know the biggest challenge can sometimes be that, and as Lorna spoke, sometimes knowing where the layers fit, and I think local governments knowing what's within their remit and what's treading on someone else's toes. Any strategies from the panel around the best ways to engage local government?
I'll just offer in Queensland, given that we've just had elections, easy way is to look at how many people didn't vote.
Thanks, Lorna. Okay, we've got another question in the chat. Is this the same as trauma-informed practice? That's a great question.
I'm happy to take that one, Michelle, if you like. Yes and no. So no, it's not. A neuro-informed practice is really a bigger lens in which trauma-informed sits within. And that's really important to us, not because we want to downplay trauma-informed practice. That's a really important part of neuro-informed practice. The strategies and the approaches and what's happening across the system within that space is really, really critical to this work. But when we think about neuro-informed, we're actually thinking about this wider lens, because our behaviour and our development isn't just about trauma. So the things we see, those examples that we see, yes, trauma can be a really important part of that. And yes, we need to know how to respond to and create the support systems that children and families need when trauma occurs or when they've experienced trauma in the past. But we also need to understand that our experiences include a whole range of other things and other supports that may not classify as trauma, but are really, really important. So if you think about something like neurodiversity, that's a particular understanding of the way different brains work that's really, really important to understanding behaviour, but it's not necessarily caused by trauma. Yes, they can sometimes interrelate, but they're not one and the same. So what neuro-informed practice allows us to do is take that broader frame, and actually, as one of the echo sessions that we've had with our communities of practice session, someone raised that what it also allows us to do is take a strength-based approach too, because often sometimes with trauma-informed, we can focus very heavily on the adversity families may or may not experience. And again, not to downplay that, really, really critical. But there are a lot of strengths and opportunities we have to support brain development that are not about trauma, and that we need to build into that so that we have this sort of holistic understanding of children, so that we can be there to support them when trauma occurs or if they have experienced trauma, but also can support them irrespective of that being, one of the things that they may have experienced in their lives. That's my perspective anyway. Sheryl, you might have a different one there, aren't you? You've worked in this space as well.
I totally agree with you, Sally. I think the other thing is, and I noticed another question about this is the same as mental health. And I sort of like, we'll start that. For me, brain health is about the functionality and the health of the organic brain. And if that's not healthy, then you'll see all sorts of behaviour from that. And the brain, as Sally said, they're all, different. Neurodiversity, come up with all these diagnoses. But I think what I see with brain health is that we just take that person as they are on this day, in the moment in time, and put some of those diagnoses to the side so that we can recognise that the power of neuroplasticity means that even if you have a diagnosis of something, of mental health or neurodiversity, that you can still change your brain and make it stronger and deadly.
Thanks, Sheryl.
I'll just add to that. One of the things we've been really intrigued by is the growing attention from the mental health community, psychiatry, psychology, actually going back to the biology and the physiology that underpins what can then get manifested as mental illness later in life. So actually now understanding both our individual differences, but also what's happened to people from pregnancy and infancy and in childhood and in adolescence is actually vital to understanding what happens perhaps later in life or at any point in life around what the manifestation of mental illness.
Absolutely. And that gut, we know there's lots of research out there backing up the gut and the brain health are just so interconnected. And that's that protective factor that we need to be talking about, because it's not just about, as I said, the child, it's about what things am I doing to make sure my brain is healthy.
Yeah, great.
And that's at an individual level.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheryl and Michael. Now, we're very close to time, but I'm just going to pass to this last question because it does link with something that we actually had a meeting this morning with government agencies. And I agree that it's really important to come at these approaches from strength-based approaches. How do these projects and programs plan to highlight what practitioners and organisations and systems and decision makers are already doing well? So, Michael, I'm going to pass that one to you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I will quickly invite Sally to jump in here too, because it's really vital that we shine a light on best practice and on innovation and on people how are actually using this knowledge. And so one of the approaches we want to take is collecting case studies. Sally.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so we're currently collecting, and if there are people online you want to reach out to us, then you can find our information. And I don't know if we can link to the QBI Brain Builders webpage as part of the chat. But what we're doing is actually collecting stories. And this came out, this wasn't, it's a lovely idea, but it actually came out of our consultation with workforces, with people across the system about what do they need to go from knowledge to action. And one of those were stories. They wanted stories of how people are actually overcoming barriers and utilising these sorts of things within their workforces. The other thing is that idea of strengths-based and not a deficit idea that workforces aren't capable. Workforces are very busy. They're not capable. And as Sheryl said, their own health is also implicated in how we act and behave ourselves. So we need to think about what our workforces or parents or those working with children and young people doing already, and how do we strengthen that and provide the language to reinforce the importance of that role, whether you are an early childhood educator, whether you are working in the state library, one of those libraries programs, you're a facilitator, you're working in the juvenile justice system, whatever it is, those interactions you have with children on an everyday basis where you are taking the time to talk to children, build relationships, all of those things are vital, but sometimes get forgotten in terms of how vital and how much they're underpinned by science and knowledge as not secondary, not nice to have, but the core work of supporting brain development. So it's really thinking about how can we work with workforces to achieve that. And we're doing those through stories and through initiatives where we're actually collecting examples of people, how they're doing this already, and therefore how can we share that with others to strengthen their own practice. And because it is out there, it is in action, it's just not always visible necessarily or talked about in that framing.
Thanks, Sally. And we've popped into the chat the links to the Brain Builders page along with the modules. As part of the post-webinar email that you'll get a link to the slides from today, you'll get a link to the resources, and we'll also share some information about a project that we just launched last week with the Queensland Mental Health Commission, which is really around it's enabling workforces and organisations to thrive. So based in Queensland, that project will be, but we'll share some more information about that. And if you're based in Queensland and you'd like to be part of that project and have something to share, we'd love to hear from you. So that concludes our webinar for today. Any final thoughts or reflections from the panel before we close?
Thanks again, Michelle. Thanks to you. Thanks to the PRF team. And thanks to Sally and Sheryl and Lorna for a fantastic job today, sharing their knowledge and insights and their work. And as you said, if anyone else is interested, please get in touch.
Great. And a huge thank you as well to Julia and Tanya, who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes, not just in bringing together panel for today and organising the webinar, but also all of the background comms and background tech. So thank you hugely to them. So thank you for your time, panelists, and thank you for your time, everybody who's joined us today. We look forward to hearing from you. If you're not already engaged with us, please do reach out. As Michael said at the very start, you know, this has got the biggest potential if we're all working collaboratively together. You know, we are all brain builders, and we all have that potential to translate the evidence into practice, to make a real tangible difference, to enable all children to thrive. Thank you for your time, everybody.